Is Jeremiah Fears the most talented prospect no one's talking about for the sixth pick? Should you fear this pick or should you be excited about the star from Oklahoma? Find out next on Locked On Wizards.
You are Locked On Wizards, your daily Washington Wizards podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Wizards, where myself and Abdullah Ayubi analyze Jeremiah Fears, the prospect that's gotten a lot of buzz from hitting a game winner over Danny Wolf, who we talked about at Michigan, and leading Oklahoma to the tournament. But there was inefficiency concerns. There's a lot of polarizing opinions about Jeremiah Fears. We're going to go into that. I'm Leif Thulin, credentialed NBA draft analyst, attendee of two of the last three NBA combines, host of Locked On NBA Big Board, and beside me is Abdullah Ayubi, diehard Wizards fan, here to provide hometown insights and passion for his beloved Wizards. And in this case, telling us if the Wizards should take Jeremiah Fears. So thank you guys for making Locked On Wizards your first listen each and every day. And remember, Locked On Wizards is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Wizards, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. And today's question is, would you draft Jeremiah Fears at 6? This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money, so take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Like I said, today we're going to dissect the game of Jeremiah Fears, discuss the floor versus the ceiling, his fit with the Wizards, and give him the playoff scout treatment we've done for multiple of these prospects. So let's turn this over to you, Abdullah. What's your initial assessment of Jeremiah Fears? We've talked about the main guys that I've seen mocked to the Wizards at 6. This is a guy that I've seen on boards higher than I've seen on mock drafts. So I think that is a little interesting. That means that evaluators like him, but maybe they don't see the fit as well. What's your initial impression about Jeremiah Fears and just how you feel about him potentially being the 6th overall pick?
Yeah, so one thing that jumps off the bat with him, I think his most NBA-ready skills are his elite explosiveness, burst and blow-by speed, a combination with his tight handles, shifty handles as well, can be able to go to the rim at ease. I think that's just something that, would be nice to see, especially a point guard here in D.C. Added to the great group that already have with Bob Carrington, Marcus Smart, and Tre Johnson and all. And you have a guy who can play make. I think he's a great playmaker as well. I'm a young point guard who's only going to get better, but the vision is there. So you pair him up with a guy in Jordan Poole, Bob Carrington. Who knows? Is Jordan Poole dealt with? We're talking about it because if you get a point guard at 6, it just makes it it alters the development of a guy in Bob Carrington, who we're both high on, and also hinders the development of the guy that we take at 6 as a guard. So good shot maker, good scoring instincts, but. We'll talk about the concerns soon, but one thing that I did was a little bit of a concern for me was the three-point shooting. I think he shot 28% from 3, and a big reason why it's concern for guards that if shot improvement needs to be there, it's a little concern for me because again, you can improve your jump shot in today's NBA, but just how much can you rely on your athleticism when you cannot shoot from beyond the arc? And kind of saw that with John Wall, but John Wall eventually, when his athleticism gave out and he got hurt, it just came to a halt. And even with Johnny Davis, I know a lot of Wizards fans don't want to hear that name, but a big reason why his NBA career was very limited is because, again, his jump shot just kept changing. He just couldn't shoot. So that's just one thing that I'm a little bit concerned on Fears, but explosiveness and vision is there.
Well, I'll give you the positive and the negative. So this is a guy who had the ball in his hands and took a not very talented team in the best conference ever, 14 bids in the SEC, to the tournament and pushed the defending champion UConn to the brink, and it was all because of him. Like, that's the positive. The guy scored 17 a game with 4 rebounds, 4 assists, and 1.5 steals. Like, he can play ball. He's also could have been in high school. So that's the other side. He was very young, and he was doing a ton at a young age. Now, here's the negative. You mentioned you're concerned about his shooting. What's the biggest weapon that we've talked about is guards who can shoot behind screens and be live dribble shooters. Well, he shot 19% on off the dribble threes. 19. That's not very good. So there are some touch indicators, though. However, he shot 36.5% from catch and shoot threes, which is pretty good. Nothing spectacular. 44% on mid-range jumpers and 50% on floaters, 85% from the free throw line. Those are typically good touch indicators. And I'm a believer in that stuff. Like that stuff matters to me. But I'm a little concerned about if he can't knock down the deep ball, can his explosive ability to get to the rack work in the NBA? There is more spacing, so I do think there is a possibility in which his explosiveness really shines even more than we were able to see at Oklahoma, where you could condense the paint. And that's where I kind of wanted to start this conversation, is that I feel like he's a bit of a boomer bust prospect. And I don't think that on too many of these prospects. Like, people will say that about Ace Bailey, but I would argue Ace Bailey's fairly safe in the sense that he's long and can shoot the ball. Like, those guys stay in the league for a long time. You may not get the superstar though, but I feel like he's fairly safe. Now, the one thing I'll say about Fears is if you put the ball in his hands and let him rock, he's really solid. Like, he can really do a lot of things because he's a pick and roll guard. Some of these other guards in this draft aren't as good with the ball in their hands and don't necessarily score as easily as Jeremiah Fears does from three different levels. And, you've talked about making big time shots. He hit a game winner over Danny Wolf and beat Michigan. He hit big shots in the SEC tournament to clinch Oklahoma's chances to make the make the NCAA tournament while in the SEC tournament. And so the reason I think he's boomer bust is if you let him develop, I think that, and you let him rock, there's a world in which you can get an all-star, and there's not that many players that you have that capacity. That said, if you let him do his thing for a little bit, there's not that many diminutive, and he's not tiny, but he's about 6'4" with basketball shoes, but he's not enormous. There's not that many guys right now that you can say, you know what, like, you're going to put the ball in your hands and you're going to let it rock and you're going to be great. There's more of those that look like mediocre guards, and maybe on a bad team it looks better. Like, there's some people that are still concerned about that with Bub Carrington, that his numbers are inflated because he was on a poor team. You could look at all the poor teams in the NBA. The Jazz have an example. Isaiah Collier can't shoot, but many people thought he could have been a first team all rookie because he had a stretch in which he had a 100 assist month, which is put him on the likes of LaMelo Ball and John Morant. So I do think he's got a very vast spread of what his outcomes are early in his career and later as well.
Yeah, and a big reason, well, I mean, when I was looking into Fears and trying to compare him to Tre Johnson, because I mean that's the current debate. If both of them are available at 6, which highly Johnson, I don't think he's going to be there. But if I think one thing that Tre Johnson has over Fears is just the shooting. I think Tre Johnson can shoot way better than him. And again, it is for me, Leif, it's a concern because again, like in today's NBA, you need to learn how to shoot. And obviously, there's going to be a baseline, but the baseline is just that low. I mean, we talked about you get that percentage of behind after screens. It's a little bit concerning. You can improve it, but just how much can you rely on your athleticism? How much can you manipulate defenders on playmake if they're going to be backing up on you all the time? So to me, it's a lot. But the resume speaks for itself, like you mentioned. Showed up in the big moments. That's what I love to see, showing up in March Madness. That's what truly matters. That's how you differentiate average players to elite players potentially in today's NBA. So Fears definitely showed up, but just how much of that shot percentage is going to dictate how he's going to do in the NBA, we'll just have to find out.
Yeah, one more thing that I think is important is how much stronger these young guys need to get when they're asked to take on a role that's prominent on an NBA team versus in collegiate basketball. So I mentioned he was 18. He could have been in high school this past year, would have been an older high schooler, was young for a college student. So his turnovers nearly match his assists, which I think his assists are good, and you could attribute some of those issues to lack of spacing. But I think one of the bigger things has to do with strength in terms of balance. He gets bumped off his spot. He's so fast, he gets bumped and it attempts wild shots. They're floaters, they're prayers, they're jumps in the air and ends up flying in the air and having to send it elsewhere. All this stuff is concerning, but if he gets stronger, which is so likely for someone who's 18 years old, and he's able to get all those places, is super alluring to me. I made a comment when he played Michigan. This was in like November, maybe very early December, and he had a game winner. He scored 30 points. I said, I'm not sure this guy isn't a top 5 pick in the draft. And at the time, he wasn't in like top 20 of boards. And right now, he's in the top 10. So I think when I made the evaluation, I'm looking at the dates and the timestamps of this. So I'm watching that game, and I wrote down in my notes right here that I'm reading, and it says the fact that he's not scared of the moment at this age and it can get anywhere on the court he wants makes me think he has top 5 upside in this class. So I wrote that in November, and I'm curious about that. So we're going to discuss that statement, that sentiment coming up next about ceiling, and we're also going to discuss the floor as well as maybe some fits with the Wizards coming up straight ahead on Locked On Wizards. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all the money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. Your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you stop managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery, and now I budget smarter and save more. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever, and you can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money and use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's Monarch Money, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. All righty, welcome back to Locked On Wizards. This is Leif Thulin and Abdullah Ayubi with you here, and we're talking about Jeremiah Fears. I talked about in the end of that segment that I had in my notes. I said this guy's upside is reminiscent of a top 5 player in this class. I wrote that in November because he can get wherever he wants on a court and is fearless, no pun intended. Abdullah, what do you think of that upside pitch? I know you've been looking at these guys more recently, and maybe some of them later in the season showed more polish, more upside as the season went on, as Fears, had some inefficient games in the SEC. What is that statement that I wrote in November?
Yeah, so you bringing that statement up, it is very intriguing. I think one thing for sure, if you're the Wizards, you want that guy that can show up in a big moment and can also be the guy who, like, if he's the number one guy, and if your Fears showing up when it matters, being that confidence, saying give me the ball and let me work, showed it. He did it in last year's college basketball and in March Madness. But at the end of the day, Leif, as a Wizards fan, seeing that profile, it just, and again going to comparison right now, it brings me a lot. I don't want to say a lot, but somewhat brings me PTSD to John Wall, Leif, a guy who is just so athletic, can play make, but again, 3-point shooting is going to hinder his career. And don't get me wrong, John Wall, without a 3-point shot, was still a top 3-point guard in his prime. He was balling out there. He was up there with the likes of Stephen Curry, Damian Lillard, Chris Paul, Kyrie Irving. But at the end of the day, in today's NBA, you have to learn how to shoot. I think that's the reality of the situation. It's going to be hard to dominate on the court when 3-point shooting is a very much concern. And with Fears, it's just a big reason why I'm tipping my hat towards Tre Johnson, because he is a dynamic playmaker and dynamic scorer as well. So I think Fears as a playmaker, I think it's going to be up there. But again, it just all comes down to transition. And maybe Coach Keefe and this coaching staff can develop his jump shot. Maybe, who knows? But at the end of the day, if it's that much of a concern going into the draft, it's a little altering to me. But definitely, I think Fears, the whole playmaking ability is something you have to consider at pick 6 if he's there.
Well, I like Tre Johnson more as well. Like I mentioned in last week's final episode, I believe I said that I have Tre Johnson number 3. That's how highly I think of Tre Johnson, is shooting, his capacity to do things with and without the ball. I gave my comparison of how he reminds me a little bit of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Bradley Beal. Like there's some very different outcomes, and maybe he's neither. Maybe he's nowhere near either of them. But Fears, I don't necessarily have a comparison for, but I will say this. If you were to ask me which player can get wherever he wants between Johnson and Fears, it's Fears, especially with spacing. Does he need to get stronger, become more polished? Absolutely. That's why Johnson's better. But Fears has more dynamic movement patterns and ability to get to the rim. So what that turns out to me is his ceiling is in an all-star. Like it looks to me that you look at this draft and you say, okay, Cooper Flagg is an all-NBA guy. Dylan Harper, you hope, is an all-NBA, and it follows the path of Cade Cunningham. It may take a couple of years to figure out the NBA patterns and spacing, but he's super polished. They'll figure it out. Then you go to number 3, and it's Ace Bailey and Tre Johnson, and you say those guys can be all-stars if they put it together and they find teams that let them do their thing and not necessarily play supporting roles. So the Sixers picking 3 makes it weird, but that's a digression. Then you go to VJ Edgecombe, and VJ Edgecombe scares me because people see upside with athleticism, but I think he's a little deficient in skill, relatively speaking, compared to these guys. I think Fears is far more skillful and not lacking for juice himself. Like he can really move, he can jump, he can get to the paint, and I see far more upside as the ball in hand, talented top scorer on a team for him than I do VJ Edgecombe. But when I watch Jeremiah Fears on mock drafts, I see him 8 through 10, and when I see him on boards, I see him 4 through 6. So I do think there's a little bit of a misnomer about this. I think people are seeing upside on the boards and teams, and then they say, oh, I don't like the fit and I don't like how quickly it happens. So that's where I'm going to ask you about the fit for the Wizards, and also when you're discussing the fit for the Wizards, can you address the floor you see, because you've mentioned a little bit of a fear regarding his shooting.
Yeah, so that's it's interesting because I was literally about to ask you, since you're a big Bub Carrington fan, how do you think would be the better fit for Bub Carrington? I mean, I guess for me, I think Tre Johnson would be better, but talking about Jeremiah Fears, I mean, maybe you can transition Bub to the 2 and Fears at the 1. They can both play make. He can play make, and they can both complement each other, be a decent backcourt. But definitely, I think the playmaking for so long here in Washington, especially since how Jordan Poole's tenure started, it just didn't really seem like we had one. And then again, and if you draft a guard at 6, whether it's Fears or Johnson, it brings up the question: are you trading Jordan Poole draft now? When do you trade him? It's just going to be hard because you have those guys in rotation, along with a veteran in Marcus Smart. And I mean, AJ Johnson, you want to develop him as well. He can play the forward, but also the guard as well. So there's a lot of options there. So if you're the Wizards, if it comes down to draft night, if you're picking Fears and between Fears or Johnson, if both of them are there, which would be amazing. But at the end of the day, you really have to think about best player available. That's one thing for sure. But just how much of an impact is this man going to make compared to the other when it comes to this young core that we have here in DC? And on top of that, you have pick 18. And I always talk about dream scenario. Dream scenario is if you somehow land a guard, you trade Jordan Poole, and you go back to the first round. And we made videos on both of them, but Mala watch for Queen. So this draft night is going to be really, really interesting. And talking about a guy like Jeremiah Fears, the playmaking, I mean, it's just something that you have to consider because, again, his quickness, his speed, how young he is, showing up in the brightest of lights. Why not him be that guy here in DC?
And that's my thing. I've said this numerous times. If you're drafting a top 5, let's say top 6 for here, and you think there's a guy who can change the course of your franchise and be a star, you got to go get him. And that's why we've talked about we like Queen. Of course, if Tre Johnson's there, you got to sprint to the podium. Fears has a little bit more of that dynamic. I think he can be an all-star guy than other players we talked about. I'd even say if the ball is given to Fears equally as we have proposed it would be given to Queen, I think he's got equal chance of being an all-star. And I think very highly of Derek Queen. The issue with Fears is there's not many guards that are 6'2" without shoes that have the ball in their hands and are super dynamic as the top guy. And the guys that are that way, Jalen Brunson, Trae Young, Steph Curry, Damian Lillard in his prime, they all have one trait shared in common. They are excellent shooters. And excellent shooters are not as reliant on athleticism. You made that point about longevity. But I don't really care too much about the longevity point because if you can get a guy who's like John Wall, and I'm not saying he's like John Wall. John Wall was a far better athlete even then, and he was a good passer. But if you can get a guy who can create pressure on the paint and develop that his pressure creates opportunities for other players, you take that in a heartbeat because Bub Carrington's a good distributor, but he's not as dynamic. So when you mentioned Bub Carrington in the fit, I agree that it's a bit of a log jam. You don't know what you're doing with Poole. You got Bub there, and I love Bub. I think the issue is the Wizards aren't good enough to have anyone rule out picking a position. Like you got to take the best available. So I don't have any qualms there. Now, the question is, if he doesn't develop a shot and his body isn't too much different, like it should grow, it should mature. All these NBA guys do so. But if it's not too different, then what are you getting? And I think that's a guy who's like a 6-man archetype as opposed to a starting point guard. So I think the ceiling's an all-star. I think the ceiling's an all-star, someone who can be 18 and 9. You know, I really think that's possible for Fears because he's got that dynamic it factor. But the floor does concern me because of the lack of off the dribble shooting, which is such a weapon in today's NBA. And I think that's like a 6th, 7th man on a solid team. And you don't want to take that at 6. However, if you're to do a redraft at 6, we've done this a couple times. There's 2 all-stars. There's a lot of busts, and the busts typically are super long, rangy guys lacking for skill. He's not lacking for skill. He just needs to refine his shot. He shot 85% from the free throw line. So let me tell you, that's one of the biggest ones. And the other thing I look at as a big indicator of touch, which is why I believe in Fears a little more than some, is volume of three-point attempts. And he's not lacking for that either. So I'm a little higher on Fears than the consensus. I don't think he's the right pick for the Wizards would be my contention, but I do think it's worth thinking about. What do you think about that assessment?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assessment. You did a really good job there. I agree. I don't think you should go with him at 6 because I think there's other better options available, but you can't rule him out because, again, his resume and what he did in college basketball is something you have to consider. But one thing that you brought up, the size, just how much is that a concern if you're a Wizard scouting department when it comes to him being barely 6'2" or 6'3"? as a defender, because a reason why I love Tre Johnson, that's because of dynamic playmaking, because his size, I think it's 6'6" and his wingspan. So just how much do you think him being 6'2", 6'3", Jeremiah Fears is going to affect his defensive play?
I do think that's something that we need to discuss because defensively, Fears had such a large role offensively. I think he had to take plays off, and I don't know if that's him necessarily and the traits, or if that's something that he's just not very good at and that can be developed. Let's discuss that in the next segment when we talk about the playoff scout, where defense becomes more and more important. So coming up next, we're going to talk about our playoff scout, where we evaluate them under the scope of watching what we observe in the playoffs, what stands out, what teams are doing in the NBA playoffs, and on winning teams build winning habits. And we're going to talk about what Abdullah just mentioned in the playoff defensive intensity. Will he be picked on? All that and more coming straight ahead on Locked On Wizards. Let's get right back to it. Abdullah brought up a great question. I actually had that question written down as something for you, and I didn't even share the notes. So great minds are thinking alike here. I think Jeremiah Fears in the playoffs is, if he's not the dude with the ball, then that is a big concern. If he's the dude with the ball and then he's a defensive liability slightly, but the Wizards have some fortification in Alex Sarr and Bilal Coulibaly, then I'm not too worried. However, if he's not the guy with the ball and he's running the show, but he's not the best player once the Wizards are a playoff team, then I do think that's a concern, because I don't think his body is built to be a good defender. I think he's got quick hands, quick feet, but he's maybe not strong, and maybe that's just because of the age. But I do think that's a concern. Did you notice anything when watching him or thinking about him as a prospect that concerns you about defense to bring that up?
So a big reason why I brought it up is when you brought up Jalen Brunson. A big reason why the Knicks, I mean, obviously Indiana is really talented, but they kept going at Jalen Brunson and his size, and at barely 6'1", 6'2". So transitioning to a guy like Fears, who were similar in a way where playmaking, size, quickness, shiftiness, tight handles. Obviously, I think Brunson's a better shooter right now, but maybe Fears can get to that point in the NBA. Who knows? But that was a concern for me, because again, like if we're going up against one of the best point guards in the league night in and night out, you're going to get picked on a lot for your size. And again, going back to the whole Fears is struggling from 3-point range in the collegiate level. I mean, obviously Brunson was a better shooter coming out of Villanova. So it's just something that I want to consider, because at the end of the day, come playoff time, that's where like you see the best of the best of the best actually show up, and you'll see these teams' imperfections. But defensively, I think just size is just a little bit of concern for me, because again, a lot nowadays, average point guard 6'6" now, 6'5". So definitely something you have to look into, especially if you want to compete and eventually win that championship.
Yeah, well, I don't think the East is necessarily that good, and maybe not even set up that well for success in the future. Look at the guards in the East that will be in contention for the coming years. Tyrese Halliburton in the finals, he's been fantastic. And also, Tyrese Halliburton has size to defend, so that bodes well to your point. Nembhard's been a hound defensively recently as well for the Pacers. You got Cade Cunningham that you need to defend. He's got some size. You've got a guy who's small but unbelievably crafting a great scorer in Trae Young. These guys that you have to routinely play against, of course, Brunson, all these guys. So I don't think Fears would draw those assignments necessarily. I think that's where the strength of having multiple wings, you have Bilal Coulibaly, you'd have Keyshawn George comes in. So I'm a little less concerned about taking on that head-to-head. But what I do think about in watching teams that have had diminutive backcourts, you look at the teams with diminutive backcourts in recent years, and they get ousted early. You look at the Cavaliers, Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland are both tremendously gifted offensive players. And if you were to get Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell out of Jeremiah Fears, you take that in a heartbeat and go and run with it. But you look at building a championship team, and though they had two great defensive players, the defensive player of the year, Evan Mobley, and Jared Allen waiting back there, those guys got attacked because they're smaller. And even though Donovan Mitchell is a tremendous athlete and Darius Garland's got quick feet, those guys, neither of them can guard according to the NBA standard. And I wonder if Fears is similar in that regard. He's got quick feet, he's got intangibles, but you just don't have the defensive habits, want to, stuff like that. And in the collegiate game, I thought he was okay defensively, but he banked on being better athlete and just being smarter and having more skill, and as opposed to being able to slide his feet and stay in front of people. But I also think he was asked to do an inordinate amount of things, and it makes it very difficult. The other area of concern that comes up from a playoff that Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland do not have, despite being small, is scoring off the dribble. Those guys are excellent shooters off the dribble. I mentioned 19% off the dribble three. That concerns me greatly, because that means teams can go under his screens, and that takes away his ability to go downhill and makes the offense a little more rudimentary. You don't get quite as good of a multifaceted approach of this guy is one of the potent factors offensively. If they can go under your screen, like teams dare Jaw to do, stuff like that, and he's not quite the athlete of Jaw, and people go under the screens, that clogs up the paint a little bit, and it takes away the dynamic playmaking and scoring strength that is his ability to get to the rack and get to the free throw line. So that's another thing he does very well. He gets to the free throw line, and though I talked about him taking some bad shots, the pressure he puts on the rim by scoring, getting to the free throw line is incredibly impressive by a freshman. So I do think the playoff would say that it's not as kind of a scout for him as it is for other players. But I mean, we talked about Derek Queen. We don't want Derek Queen to be the rim protector. Like, he'd be defensively picked on as well. People would go for that switch all the time. And if they're not switching, that means they're going to play. You got to put two on the ball and they're going to throw it to the middle. So all these guys, they're going to have flaws when we do this playoff scout. There's very few that come out like ahead of the curve. We say, wow, this guy's going to stand out in a playoff series because he does this, this, and this well. There's a reason these guys we think are going to be there at 6. But this is a good draft to have the 6th pick, as opposed to last year where the 6th pick was Tijon Salaun. And no shots at Tijon Salaun, but the guy, I watched him in person, watching him warm up, and he's super raw, and he's like a colt, a baby deer, baby giraffe, however you want to put it. He just isn't fully formed. At least Jeremiah Fears, despite being super young, is a fully formed, effective basketball player.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up my question. You brought up a lot of good points there. Because I don't think Tre Johnson's going to fall. I mean, it would be insane if he fall the top 5, but when it comes to Fears, like, is there how low do you think he can go? Do you think he can go past 10 or no? He's a lock top 8.
That's a good question. I've heard a lot of rumbling that the Nets really like him at 8. So my hunch is that he's picked 8th overall, or no, I should say no later than 8th overall, perhaps earlier. Is there a world in which Fears falls because maybe someone else falls and the perception for the Nets changes because they didn't think this guy would be there and they changed? Maybe they don't use the draft pick. The Nets are involved in a lot of trade rumors, and that means a lot of teams that have guards in this top 10 don't necessarily feel as strongly and as compelled to take him. That's entirely possible. My guess is he's drafted within the top 8 because I think a lot of teams like his upside, his ability to play with the ball, get to the rim and score, and believe that 85% from the free throw line will equate to decent shooting. Like, that's the biggest concern, but at least there's volume of 3-point attempts, and free throw percentage typically are good indicators. But I do think there's going to be a chance he falls outside the top 10 because at 6'2" without shoes, and you look at the guards in today's NBA, no one's really had significant success as the main operator at that size. It just is not happening right now in today's NBA, and I think that hurts him more than his actual game does. Like, I think it's an unfair evaluation tool, but I think that's what forms people's minds, and that's why this playoff scout's important.
Yeah, no, I agree, man. I just for me, I love Fears. I mean, definitely what he did in college basketball, especially at his size and playmaking, but just shooting, the S word, man, is really a concern for me, and just a big reason why I'm a big Tre Johnson guy for him. And even a guy like Queen, and even I would take the risk of Malawatch over Fears because, again, like, fit and best player available kind of meshes well with him rather than Fears.
All right, let me ask you a kind of a would you rather or rank them out for this final bit. So I'm going Common, Malawatch, and Queen. We've talked about that, and it sounded like you leaned Queen. Am I correct in that?
Yep.
So
yep.
Okay, what about Fears or Knueppel?
Man, that's a good one, Leif. I can't lie. Because, again, two different scenarios. Kon Knueppel was on a Duke team. One of the likes of Cooper Flag was the number 1 overall pick. Had Common, Malawatch on the team, so not much of that attention on him. And when it came to Fears, he was the number 1 guy that was leading the realm. But just because of Knueppel's shooting, and I get that, and he's not that much of a great playmaker compared to Fears, but I think the 3-level scoring, I think this also the size, I think checks off a little more boxes compared to Fears. But when it comes to potential wise, I definitely see Fears having that more potential. But again, I'm just the whole boomer bust thing. You brought it up. It's concerning, man. You don't want to mess up on this draft pick because, again, and you want to build this Wizards championship team, and again, it's going to hold you back a year or two if you mess up at 6. So for me, I'll take Knueppel over Fears. But don't get me wrong, Fears potential is through the roof.
See, that's the interesting thing here, though, because if you were to say you're picking at 4, and let's say Tre or someone were gone, you were elated about the possibility of Ace Bailey at 2, and even initially when we were talking about the draft before the combine, or sorry, before the lottery happened, and you would say, oh, there's a little boomer bust there, but in the safety in that would have been Harper. But there, you're willing to take that risk for that. Whereas at Fears, there's a little more of a risk because you need to get it right at 6 in order to set yourself up for the next draft and get the star there. So there is a calculus that's going on for you. It's going on for a bunch of Wizards fans. It's always fun to hear the perspective from you, Abdullah, as well as other people regarding this. I would take Fears over Knueppel. I don't think he's a better fit. I just think he's got better upside, and I believe in upside because I don't think you're going to change your trajectory too much by missing here versus taking a guy who's a role player. It would be bad if you were to take someone and then you let a star fall, which would be possible, but I don't think you'd be choosing between Fears and Knueppel. I think it's more likely between those two centers. Well, that'll do it for us on Locked On Wizards today. This is a fun episode diagnosing the game of Jeremiah Fears. Let us know what you guys think. Would you take Fears at 6? Are there concerns you have? Is he ranked too low by many mock drafts? Because some people really think he's a top 3 talent in this class, and I can see why, because he's 18 years old and was incredibly effective on a team that was not super talented. I resonate with what Abdullah said about having fears about Fears. So let us know what you guys think. And we're going to get back to you on the comments there. But thank you guys for making Locked On Wizards your first listen today. And for your second listen, check out Locked On NBA Game Night. Every game, every night until an NBA champion is crowned. And we got the finals coming up soon. So get local analysis on a national scale. Find NBA Game Night on Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts.